A group of experts is taking a much needed multi-year look at New Jersey's revenues and expenses. This is the Issues Watch podcast. Hi, I'm Jeff Kazerman, Vice President of Government Relations at the New Jersey Society of CPAs, and welcome to the Issues Watch podcast. On June 8th, at the height of the state budget process, the Multi Year Budget Workgroup released its first report called Comparing Multi-Year Revenue Forecasts with Current Services Budget Projections. The nonpartisan workgroup was formed by the Sweeney Center for Public Policy. The work group is made up of former high-ranking administration and legislative budget officials, policy experts, and economists. The NJCPA's CEO, Ralph Thomas, also serves on the work group. With the state awash in billions of federal COVID aid and billions more in unanticipated tax revenues, the work group was tasked with addressing the question of whether the state's revenues would continue to grow, or was it facing a fiscal cliff that would force tax hikes or budget cuts if a recession hits. So the group did an analysis of whether revenue collections will be adequate to continue state services at the current level over the next 5 years. And it will continue to issue reports with updates on its projections. While this report did not include policy recommendations, future reports will. With us today to discuss the report is workgroup member Charles Steindell. Charles is an economist with a ton of experience in New Jersey. He is the editor of Business Economics. He's a former New Jersey chief economist and a former senior vice president at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Welcome, Charles.
Hi.
So tell us, what were the primary goals of the multi-budget workgroup report?
Well, you start with, of course, the last couple of years, and it's true in this budget, New Jersey found itself passing a budget where the state had a lot of cash, was in a strong cash position, which is entirely against where the state has been for the last 20 or 30 years. And I think part of the question is we wanted to dispel the euphoria that this situation could well likely not exist, and the state could find itself in a position in the not too very distant future where it has to make some hard choices to maintain its balanced budget. And we just wanted to lay out the scenarios in which this can happen. This is something, the sort of procedure which most states do. New Jersey, for whatever reason, has never done this as a formal process. So former Senate President Steve Sweeney thought it was a good idea to get some people together who've worked in state government, administrations of both parties and other people, to lay out possible scenarios and see where the state would be in the next few years under current policies.
So what kind of methodology did you use to put the report together?
Okay, the methodology was pretty straightforward. Like I said, it was what we call a current services forecast. What we were assuming some basics, that there has been some aid from the federal government to support Medicaid and New Jersey Transit. That will fade. That's laws. We have to take that to account. The assumption is the current ramp up in school K-12 funding to the formula that was agreed on about 10 or 15 years ago will continue. For the rest of the state budget, it's basically just cost increase, sort of ongoing cost increases. So that's the spending side. On the revenue side, in order to avoid disputes, we accepted the administration's projections for fiscal year 22 and 23. That's part of the budget document. The document has revenue assumptions for fiscal 23. Then we put together economic scenarios, how the national and state economy would do, a range of them, and tried to project what New Jersey's tax revenues would be for them. And that leaves us with a spending scenario and a revenue scenario, a series of revenue scenarios, actually. And that leads you to just calculation, just run the arithmetic. How much cash would the state have left over under those scenarios? And we know under the state constitution, the state is, except in very unusual circumstances, is not allowed to borrow without voter approval. It's supposed to have a budget which is based on the resources assumed to be available in the fiscal year. And so the question is, would the state run out of cash?
So what did you folks find?
I think
were
the general belief, there's an overwhelming chance, and this is based on an assumption that the economy doesn't boom, the economy could boom, that the state would run out of cash in the next 2 or 3 years, that the state would run through this enormous surplus. And that wouldn't, at the time, we're saying there's about an 80% chance that that would happen. I think I would raise the chances a bit now because that was in June. The economic outlook seems a little less favorable. So I think we thought there was a very high probability the state would run out of cash, not this year, not next, but say fiscal 25, fiscal 26, which would
Right.
require some mid-course directions. The state would have to change some policies.
Right, right. And I do think there is a perception amongst a lot of folks that like, wow, look at all these billions we've got and there's no consequences for having it. We'll just keep spending. But like you said, you start putting the money into ongoing programs. That's it. You're not going to have the money. So the state is awash in billions of extra dollars that no one could have foreseen before COVID hit. In addition to the 6.8 billion that's going into the fiscal year 2023 surplus, the budget also includes several billion for debt defeasance fund, 2 billion for a new property tax relief program, and almost 2 billion for the school development authority. This is money that, as far as I know, is not available before COVID. So where did all this money come from? How much is from federal stimulus money? How much from above average tax revenues? And how much from anything else?
Some portion of it is from the COVID assistance, of course, and there's still unspent and unappropriated COVID money out there. And that is available, but that's only a portion. The overwhelming majority of it comes from tax revenues coming in incredibly strong, and from the borrowing that was done 2 years ago from fear that revenues would collapse. As you know, as I mentioned, under normal circumstances, the state government cannot borrow without prior voter approval, but except, of course, in a dire emergency. And the administration argued in the summer of 2020 that such an emergency was existing, and the legislature voted to approve borrowing, and the state Supreme Court agreed with that. So about $3 or $4 billion was borrowed as a result of that. So that's part of it. The other part was, frankly, revenues just kept soaring in, and we can't pin that down exactly, but a lot of it we can. Part of it was the economy was just underlying stronger than people expected. Largely, the enormous amount of federal aid kept consumers spending hopping, and that helped drive sales tax revenue, which is a very big part of the state budget. The other part was the stock market, until 6 months ago, was booming, incredible surge and booming, and that presumably has generated lots of capital gains realizations. We don't know how much. That's the problem. We really can't keep a. We really don't know capital gains realizations till years after the fact, from the way they come in and the way they're the way they're reported. They're recorded. You don't see it like wages, where you see withholding every week. Right. Capital gains came in. New Jersey has a very, very progressive income tax system, a very high top rate. Capital gains generally come in from the wealthiest people, and that generated billions in income tax revenue that was not foreseen. The final one is the corporate tax, which has also been several $1 billion higher than we expected. New Jersey increased its corporate tax rates, changed its rules for what fraction of worldwide corporate profits would be considered profits in the state of New Jersey. But we can't completely pin that down. The corporate tax is extremely complicated, very hard to pick up. So we have all those factors coming in. Well, also, of course, we have the housing boom, which generated a lot of real estate transfer tax revenue. And of course, that tends to generate sales tax revenue when people move into the house and starts buying stuff for it. But I think what's going on is consumer spending will be slowing. Even if we don't have a recession, consumer spending isn't going to continue to be as strong as it was. Obviously, capital of the stock market has leveled off. We might have from the churning of the stock market this year, we might still have strong capital gains revenues for a while, but eventually they're going to tail off. I think that's clear. So that part's going to fade. Corporate tax, we don't know. So we know this boom in revenues is just not going to continue. Revenues might actually fall. I mean, our scenario, among other things, is a legislated drop back in corporate tax rates in a year or two. The increase in corporate tax rates from a few years ago was temporary. We have that built, and that costs the state some money. So that's part of the scenario. So revenues are just not going to grow like they were, but expenses are going to continue to rise.
Right. Yeah, it still amazes me how well the economy and the state did in the middle of a pandemic, but we'll talk about that later. In addition to all the extra billions we have now, the state is slated to receive about 12 billion in federal infrastructure money over the next few years. So will this relieve some of the pressure on future budgets? If so, was this factored into the report, this money?
Not really. I mean, I suspect it's going to go more for capital spending projects we weren't going to do.
Okay.
So the state would have to start to chip in more, like all the various proposals and how solid they are for improving the rail connection across the Hudson. So
right.
What the state has put some aside, that $3 billion in debt defeasance and infrastructure would provide some support for that. So the 12 billion, and also it's going to be spent over many years. The state has a budget of over $50 billion. 12 billion spread over 6-10 years is not that big a difference. It's nice to have, it's not that big a difference.
For some reason, I thought it was coming in like within 5 years. Okay.
Well, even in 5 years, it's still only a relatively small fraction of the state's budget.
Okay. So many of and we kind of touched on this, but many of the big question marks in the report revolve around what the economy will look like for the next few years. So what did the report have to say regarding a recession? And then you can also tell us how you think that has changed since June when the report was issued.
We put the three scenarios together. First, we put a baseline scenario, which would just have growth slowing in the next year or two from the Federal Reserve, increasing interest rates, and the cessation of the COVID aid from the federal government. So that would slow the economy down. Might be close to a recession, slow growth, but then you would go back to normal growth a year or two after that. We put a probability around 45% on that happening. We put a probability of about 25% on a strong economy, the economy being somewhat stronger over that scenario, the stock market being stronger, not super strong, but stronger. That was the optimistic scenario. And finally, we put about 35% odds on an outright recession, starting towards the end of this year, continuing into next year. And after that, you get a recovery. And inflation would slow down on that one. The stock market would slow down, capital gains revenue would slow down. Since June, the numbers have gotten a bit worse, and I would say the probability of a recession about 45%, and the probability of the optimistic scenario down to about 15%. So a bit worse, off.
Right.
So that's how we squared it, and all that's a national outlook. It feeds into a New Jersey outlook, which feeds into New Jersey tax revenues. None of these relationships are perfect, by the way. If the relationships between the national economy, the state economy, and tax revenues were good, we wouldn't have the forecast errors we've frequently seen in estimating state revenues.
Right. Yep. So in your mind, what are the main take-home points that you think lawmakers should consider as they move forward during next budget season?
I think next year we should start to see some chickens come home to roost. We should see revenues start to slow. We will have adequate cash to get through next year. It's hard to imagine a scenario where we don't. I mean, that would be a really, really awful.
Right.
But I think at that time, they should begin to become aware, we have to think about what programmatic changes we might have to keep the budget sustainable over the long run without making emergency last-minute changes, which has been all too often New Jersey's fate the last 30 years or so. To come April, May, drastic changes had to be made in the budget to get through the end of the fiscal year. So I think that's really up to the legislators and the administration, the people in Trenton, to make those decisions. And some of them are not going to be pleasant. I mean, you know, some of them we think are good for the state. Some of them we think there could be reforms in areas like maybe spend a little money, save some money, like in areas like technology infrastructure for the state government, you know, deliver
Right.
better, more cheaply, but there'll be an upfront cost, considerable upfront cost to do that. So there are areas like that, which other members of the commission, that's not really my scenario, we'll explore, we'll start to think about.
So I guess it's a good thing that, you know, this report comes out and, you know, lawmakers can look at it and already at this point have a good idea of where they may stand. The work group will be issuing another report with projections in January.
Yes, at that
Well,
time, we'll have a better idea of basically the economic outlook and how fiscal 20, you know, and what the risks are to fiscal 23 budget, and start thinking about 24.
so the report that was issued in June that did not, if I recall correctly, that didn't include any policy recommendations.
No, we didn't have any policy recommendations. I think some members will start to put out some policy options, some options on what might be reasonable things to do in areas such as the big drivers is the state government. That's healthcare is a very big driver. We've been seeing, obviously, you know, this latest story about health insurance premiums for public workers, that sort of thing. Health is a big area. K-12 education is always a big area. So we'll be thinking about those areas. There will be people thinking about what could be done and what are reasonable things to deliver services, hopefully services at least the current, if not better level, hopefully by implementing some cost savings that we can, or if we're going to implement or try to make things less onerous as best we can.
That's great. And hopefully the lawmakers will pick up on some of those recommendations. So why doesn't New Jersey, you said there's other states that do these kind of projections on an annual basis. Why doesn't New Jersey do this? And could such a requirement be enacted into law so that the state does have to do projections every year?
Well, it's hard to say why. New Jersey, the unique feature, I think, of New Jersey's government is the unusual power of the governor. Quite frankly, under the state constitution, the governor is responsible for maintaining a balanced budget. That's the governor's job. The buck stops there. The governor makes the revenue projections. It's in the Constitution, the state constitution. The legislature could pass a law, but the Constitution, if the governor chooses to ignore it, the Constitution says it's the governor's responsibility. So that's the thing that enters in. I think there's just been a general belief that the governor can always maintain the balanced budget, and the governor always has maintained the balanced budget, but often in extremely awkward ways.
Yeah.
Other than that, I have no real explanation as to why New Jersey doesn't do it. We know that the rating agencies, for example, would dearly love for us to do that, to do this. I suspect this is as much that as I suspect this is much for, you know, concern that given that the governor can do this, if we actually release numbers and see how difficult it would be to maintain state programs at the quote, what is called the legislated level, which can always be overridden by the state budget, there might be, you know, considerable political fear. But that's just speculation. I have no real explanation.
Right. You know what would be great is if your group or some other group, you know, if the state won't do it, then you know, I personally believe groups like yours need to try and do it on an annual basis.
Well, it's good to have, it's good, I think, to have more public discussion and input into state budget processes. Mostly what we get, of course, the people who are concerned with their own
Right.
programs, concerned with their own taxes, is perfectly legitimate. But there's very few people in New Jersey outside state government who take a look at the broad issues of the state budget.
So that about wraps it up. Thanks again for joining us today, Charles, and I hope
glad to do.
look forward to having you on again.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Thanks for listening and watching. To access the Multi-Year Budget Workgroup report and to learn more about New Jersey's budget, visit njcpa.org/NJBudget. And be sure to support the New Jersey CPA Political Action Committee, the only nonpartisan group in New Jersey dedicated solely to fighting for CPAs in the legislative arena. Learn more and contribute at njcpa.org/PAC.